In this video, we're going to be looking at how we might go about improving an embroidery file that we made here in Inkscape, and then we converted to embroidery with InkStitch. Now, this is not my file. This is a file that was provided by one of our Facebook group members. And let's go over to our Facebook group. It's called Learning Inkscape and InkStitch, and this is Mark's post. And what he's saying is that he says he's having trouble digitizing some lettering, particularly small ones. The simulator looked perfect inside the InkStitch plugin. I understand it's small, but for what reason could the letters become so warped? When I have stuff digitized and sent back, sometimes smaller than this, there's no issue, so I must be doing something wrong. And in particular, if you look at this particular design, you could see that this text especially is very small. Now, you know, the one of the challenges is what is wrong with the design could be a number of different things. It could be in the digitizing. That's certainly one possibility. But it also could be something entirely different. It could be the just how the garment was hooped. If the garment was hooped loose in the hoop, then certainly that would cause puckering, because these embroidery stitches are going to pull on that garment, and that's why when we hoop stuff for doing embroidery, it needs to be nice and tight. Certainly could be the stabilizer that was used. If this was tearaway stabilizer, I mean, there's a variety of things that it could be that aren't really specified in the problem. So it could be several different things, but what we'll do is we'll take a look at the design itself and see how we might improve it, and some things that we might look at to see if we could modify it in some way to make it stitch better. So, so let's go ahead and take a look at the design. Okay. So first of all, let's go through the simulator just super quick. InkStitch Visualize Simulator, and see how the design is stitching out. So you can see we have some fill stitch objects, looks like. And then we have some, and one of the things that I kind of spot right off by looking at this is the satin stitch density seems to be relatively low, because you can, so that's kind of interesting. That was the first thing that just I caught my eye. So let's back up here and let's watch this a little bit more carefully. I don't know. I'll have to go into params to see what's going on, I think, because something seems a little off over here. I don't know exactly what's happening here. I'll have to go in params and see. Let's do that real quick. Let's go into params and let's just look at this first object right here. So what do we got going on here? A lot depends on, you can see here, just in our layer stack here, we've got a lot of pieces, a lot of groups, which, certainly you could do it this way. I don't know that I would do it this way, but at any rate, let's take a look at this first object. So we'll go into, I probably would not do all these groups within layers. I would probably just do additional layers, but that's just how I work. But at any rate, let's go into params here and look at that first object, because something seemed off right there. Okay, so it says legacy fill method. I'm not sure why that particular fill method was chosen, but okay. All right, that's why it looked off to me, because that wasn't a typical fill. So let's go ahead. Okay, now I see that's why that looked off, because it was a legacy fill, not a traditional fill. So that's certainly one thing. How big is this object? Let's take a look at that. So this object, let's go ahead and look at it in inches. So this object is about this is the one I was looking for right here. So this object is roughly not quite, about 3/4 of an inch. It's really 7/8. So let's just call it an inch by an inch and a half. Now typically, now you don't have to do it this way, but typically on a small item like this, it would probably, in my opinion, again, this is just my opinion, um, it would look better if this piece was in satin versus fill. Now, I don't know if this was specifically selected to be a fill for a reason, um, or if it was just lack of, hey, I don't know how to make a satin. You know, it could be that. So let me just show you how you would convert it to satin because it's so easy. All right. And one of the reasons why I personally don't like to create, I tell you what, the one reason I personally don't like to create groups is when you go to select items, it's always going to select the group and not the items within the group. So I just think it's going to be easier if we convert these things to layers. So let's just go ahead and get rid of the group here. So we're going to push everything to layer 2 here, and then we'll go ahead and get rid of that group. Okay. So this layer is made up of the left, the bottom, and then the right. So maybe we'll put that, we'll do left, right, maybe even do bottom first, I don't know. And then that, okay? So we'll just leave it, for now, we'll just leave it in that order. It really doesn't matter, I don't think a whole lot. But let's look at that first piece. So what I'm gonna do here is I am gonna have, first of all, we can't have a fill with satin. So then shift click on red. And then in order to turn this into satin, what we're going to do is we're just going to double click on our path and we're going to add a node right here just by double clicking and then hit Shift B. That will break that node apart. And then we need to do the same thing with this node. Shift B. Okay, so we now have satin. Okay, so the only other thing that we have to do is we got to clean up our nodes. And our nodes are going to dictate our stitch angles. So we don't need that one, that one, that one, that one, that one, or that one. Okay, and all I'm doing is clicking my Control Alt and then clicking on the various nodes that I do not want. Okay, so there we go. So now we have start and end, and then we got a couple of stitch angle pairs. So now if we go into extensions, InkStitch and params, we'll turn off running stitch. And there we go. We have a nice satin stitch. And because we specified our stitch angles with our nodes, we'll choose apply and quit. And there we go. And now I'm going to duplicate that. Okay. And then I will go ahead and mirror this. So we'll go ahead and mirror it. And then I can then move this to the other side. We might go ahead and turn on snapping just so I can snap it right into place. Okay. So now that's taken care of. So then this object here, we actually don't need that object anymore. Okay. Now this is a fill object as well, which I feel like because it's so skinny, so tiny there, that really should be a satin. But again, that's just my personal preference. So I'm gonna go ahead and make it that. Select that one. Select this one. Shift B. That will break those two nodes. We'll go ahead and add a stroke. And then for our stitch angles, we'll go here. And then this guy here, we do not need. Okay, so we'll just get rid of that. That's just an extra node that we don't need. So there we go. So let's go back into extensions, InkStitch params. And of course, we'll get rid of our running stitches. Okay, so we can see here, anytime we have an issue like this, the issue happens to involve it's got to involve an extra node. And see that extra tiny little node right there? Couldn't see that when we were zoomed that far out. That's what the issue is. So, okay. So that was what the issue was. So now if we take a look at it, go to params. So anytime you see something super weird that you don't expect, it's probably because you did something super weird that the software didn't expect. Because if we do it right, then you see the results that we get are pretty accurate there. So okay, so I am happy with that. Now what we could do, because it looked like it was struggling a little bit, we could add a couple nodes over there to specify some stitch angles, and I think that makes it look better. All right, so moving on. Same thing here. We're going to turn this into satin because I just feel like ultimately that is going to yield us better results. So Shift B. Now those nodes are broken. We're not going to have no fill. We are going to have an outline, and we are going to delete that and that and that. And then we'll add in a set right here for our stitch angles. And now we'll go ahead and InkStitch params. Get rid of our running stitches, and yes, we have good looking satin there. All right, so that's all taken care of. So now we can hop over here, and I want to take a look at, let's start with our text up top. I know the problem is primarily down below, but let's take a look at the top. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to click on the letter I here. And one of the things that we see is if you look here, you will see that the current width is 0.8 of a millimeter. And it is almost 4 inches tall, or no, 4 millimeters tall. I'm sorry, 4 inches. 4 millimeters, that's what I meant. So first of all, I kind of feel like we're going against the grain in what we should be doing. And by that I mean, if you look, 0.8 of a millimeter is very tiny. Okay, it's very tiny. So that's problem number one. A 1 millimeter satin column is very, very tiny. So just inherently, especially depending on the fabric that we're stitching on and things like that, a 1 millimeter satin is going to be very, very skinny. But having said that, let's go ahead and take a look at the params for this particular object. And we're just selecting the letter I here. And we'll take a look and see what our params are. So, one thing they did in this particular example, and that's why when I first looked at the file, I thought, that's interesting. So you could see that the zigzag spacing from peak to peak is at 0.4, and that's not necessarily standard. Okay, now they may have done that to back off the stitch density a little bit because it was bunching up or what have you. So you certainly can use 0.4. But one thing they don't have here is they don't have any underlay whatsoever. And now this is a very narrow satin column already, but there's no underlay at all. And typically with these very narrow satin columns, we wouldn't necessarily even have underlay. If we come over here to contour underlay and chose a contour underlay just so you could see what it would actually do, you could see that it would basically, because this satin column is so skinny, it basically would give us a center walk underlay. Okay, so if I chose center walk underlay, you would see that it's basically exactly the same. And that's because the contour underlay, um, the reason it looks the same is because of the inset distance is just too small, so it just gives us 1. Okay, you see the inset distance here is 0.4. So if we 0.4 and 0.4 is 0.8, obviously, and that's how wide this satin column is. So is this going to solve your problem? That one stitch there? No, that's not going to solve your problem. But the big takeaway here is that there's nothing wrong with the digitizing side of it. Okay, I feel like having the 0.4 spacing is probably pretty good. So I don't think the real issue here is uh, the digitizing. So let's go ahead and well, we can leave that or not leave that. I'm just going to go ahead and choose apply and quit. So we can leave that or not leave that. Now, just one other thing to point out here is when we click on the entire design and we come in here to InkStitch and we choose simulator here, we're going to see another issue with this design, and that is we did not take control of the froggies. So if I select frogs here, you will see that we have lots of frogs. Okay, and we shouldn't have that many frogs. We have to kill all them frogs, because you see we have all of this crazy jump stitch happening. So that's less than ideal. Okay, so that's certainly one thing to consider, because if we have all those jump stitches going every which direction, then we would have to cut all those jump stitches at the end. Okay, so that's another just another thing that I noticed right away. Now, one other thing is just a pet peeve of mine, but is rungs. Rungs, glorious rungs. We want to avoid rungs at all possibilities. Okay. So you see here we have a node here and a node here. We have a node here and a node here, a node here and a node here, a node here and a node here. Let me back up just to kind of illustrate the point here. Let's look at this. So let's look at this, and I'm going to duplicate this, and we're going to look at this. Okay. So we're going to go with our new no rung mantra. Okay, versus the rung mantra. Now I realize, depending on exactly how this was created, these rungs may have been auto-generated, possibly, I don't know. But I just wanted to illustrate the point that if we come in here to InkStitch and let's look at the params for these. So it'll show us side by side what these look like. And you could see almost stitch for stitch. I'm just trying to see if there's any differences there whatsoever. No, doesn't appear to be any differences whatsoever between the two. Okay, and so point being, the takeaway here is we don't need rungs. So if we don't need the rungs, then there's no point in having the rungs, because it's obviously that is much cleaner. This may be text, InkStitch text. I don't really know, and that's why we have all these bloody rungs. But that's just because I haven't trained them yet to not use rungs. So we will get rid of the rungs here. And on the letter R here, and just show you that we don't. Maybe this will be a good, another good example of why we don't want rungs. So let's just duplicate this, and let's move it up. We'll move the duplicate up, and we'll come up here, and we won't have rungs on this guy right here. We're gonna go in, and we're gonna go our new style, no rungs, no rungs. Okay. Now, one thing to point out here, when we don't have rungs, we do have to have matched node pairs to define our stitch angles. So for example, we have match, a match, a match, a match, a match, and a match. So in other words, we don't need rungs. That will take care of it. So now if we select both of these and look at them side by side, go back into params. You'll see almost stitch for stitch. You should see almost stitch for stitch. They look absolutely identical. Okay, so very, very similar. This you can see is maybe just a little bit different than that. It's maybe a little bit pointier right there, but otherwise everything else is the same. So we'll choose apply and quit. I'll take a quick look at this to see if there's something in the design that's causing that. Nope. So you can see that there. That looks good. If we wanted to, let's just see if by adding those extra, if that tightens up our corner a little bit. And then over here, let's see if we do the same thing, if that tightens up the corner a little bit. So let's just see once. Go back into params. Because once we kind of understand how nodes will affect our corners and things, then, it'll all make a little bit more sense too. And yes, do you notice how much sharper that corner is? Because we leaned into it a little bit there. So I feel like that just gives us a more defined spot. And I do think that actually looks a little bit better. Okay. So that would just be something that I would go ahead and do. Now, let's take a look at that params again. I think you're okay on the params. And if you look back at the stitch out also, it is, so here the zigzag spacing is 0.3. So I don't know if that was intentional to have it different. Let me look at the zigzag spacing there. And see, that's 0.4. So that's a little unusual. So we definitely want it to be consistent. That's for sure. I'm pretty sure we would want it to be consistent. So I'm just going to go ahead and go in here and delete all these rungs because they're not necessary. We already took care of that C. In fact, it doesn't have any rungs. So we'll go ahead and get rid of the rungs for our R. Okay. And then get rid of these. We definitely don't need all of those. So I feel like that alone will just kind of help clean that all up. Now, I do have some concerns. I don't understand why or how we've got all these various groups here. I just feel like that's really not necessary. I don't like doing that. We might go back in, and that's not gonna make the design stitch out any better or any worse or anything like that, but I don't know. To me it's just more confusing when it's like that. So first thing we're doing here is we're just getting rid of these rungs. All right. I just think that will clean up the artwork a little bit, and that'll be kind of nice to do that. And it'll be a nice experiment too to take a look at what we've got here and figure out if there's changes that we need to make for all of our various stitch angles. Okay, or if we don't need to make any changes. So that's that. And then come down here and we'll change it up down here as well. Our R here. I'm guessing the text was made with the lettering tool inside InkStitch. I haven't really done a lot of in-depth look at creating fonts for InkStitch. If these stitch angles have to be in there for some reason, I would suspect that's not the case, that we don't have to have these rungs in our font files, but I also don't know because I've never made an InkStitch font. But I would venture to say that that's not probably necessary. Okay, so now we've done all of that. So I don't know if we could just select everything and does not look like if we group everything, yeah, then we're just going to have subgroups, and then you can see it says group to layer, ungroup. So we'll just go back to where we were. There's just a lot of odd groups in here, and like I said, I probably wouldn't necessarily do it that way. Fair number of paths there. So this, that is in a group. Okay, like I said, I don't think it's that critical that it is in a group. It's just a little bit confusing to me how that's all in there. But we can come to params here, and let's go ahead and settle on a 0.3 is probably okay for our zigzag peak to peak. So we can go ahead and do that. We don't have any pole compensation. I'm just looking to see what else we might have here. All right, nothing else really stands out to me. So I think we're okay. Now, if we look at the way all of this is stitching out, you can see this letter here. It's got some kind of weird stitch angles kind of going every which direction. I'm just going to look and see if there's anything else that really catches my eye. These right here, I would like these to be a little bit more straight across, right there on our letter V, and maybe a little bit of work here on our letter N. So let's go ahead and choose apply and quit. Now all that density is all the same now. So on our letter O here, what we could do here is we could go and specify some pairs. So we have all these nodes here. So first of all, if we get rid of some of these nodes, that will help define our stitch angles a little bit. So that's good. So see how these are at an angle, and these are at an angle, and these are at an angle, these are at an angle. So now that will, because we had a lot of excess nodes there, so now you'll see, if we go into params here, now you'll see that that is a quote-unquote proper O. And you can see what I was talking about there. Our stitches are a little bit more uniform. Now, could this be a little bit straightened out? Yep, I think it could. So let's go ahead and close that. And well, why is that like that? Well, look at how high that stitch angle is. So if I just bring this down to here and delete that, okay, and maybe do the same thing over here and delete that, and then come up here to extensions, InkStitch params. Now you'll see it stitch out just a little slightly differently. See? Very nice, very clean look. So now, what else did we see? We saw on, what else did I say? I think it was my letter V. Let's look at that. So params. Let's take a look at that. And yes, I feel like these could be straightened out a little bit. They're not terrible, but all we have to do is just come in here and we'll add some stitch angles, be a little bit more specific of how we want this to look. One there, and one there, and now that should stitch perfectly horizontally, like about from mid-letter up. We'll see here. Yes, see how nice and horizontal those are? And then we're leaning into that curve, and then they're nice and horizontal. Very nitpicky stuff. Very nitpicky stuff. Let's look at the end, see what that looks like again. You see how these kind of go up at an angle? It's just a little strange. So we'll go ahead and close that out. Let's look at our nodes. So we don't have any excess nodes. So what we could do here is we could go, so we want this to be more or less horizontal. Okay, so that takes care of that. And then we want this to kind of lean into our corner a little bit. So now we're starting to lean. Now back over here, we want to go horizontal, and then we want to lean in a little bit. Okay, we'll do the same thing here. Maybe we'll lean in a little bit, coming around the bend there. And now let's just take a look and see if those little changes were for the better or for the worse. It's mostly just very personal, you know, what you like or what you don't like. But you can see how these are more or less horizontal and then leaning into the corner, and these are nice and horizontal. So yeah, I like that. Not too bad. Okay. So we have specified now, we have specified 0.3 of a millimeter from a zigzag point to point, which I think is a good number. So we're good there. We haven't dealt with, obviously, we haven't dealt with our froggies. So that's another whole topic, for sure. So we'll go ahead and choose apply and quit. And one thing I guess we could look at is what is the stitch order of this, because if I select that, so A, I, R, F, O, R, C, E. So it does look like that is, and then it jumps way up here. Did you see that? So we come from this group, we jumped way up here to this group. So so that's kind of odd. So this object is ahead of this object, which it shouldn't be, if we want this to stitch out like in order. So let's look at that and see how off that is. So let me just come in here to InkStitch, and that was just something that we could definitely take a look at. Devil's in the details. There really is a lot to consider when we're doing this. So this, first of all, this is stitching. Our A, our I, F, O, R, C, E. That's all right. And then look at it's stitching backwards. Okay. Which, you know, that's not terrible that it's stitching backwards. I could see that now. Okay. All right. You know, that's probably okay too. So that's not so bad. I see why that is doing that now. Um, so it's jumping from E to N and then working backwards and then jumping from here to here. Um, so you can see here when it's done stitching the C, it's strange that we don't have. How many thread trims do we have? 22 thread trims and 22 jumps. Okay, that's definitely an issue. It should not be like that. So I don't know if there were some commands that were added to this, and that's why where every jump we also have a thread trim possibly. So that is going to definitely be problematic. so so anyhow, that's definitely something we need to look at. This little guy here, he is um, 0.4 of a millimeter. So that is extremely small. Now, if we go back over here and look at our graphic, you can see that that basically is non-existent, more or less. Um, so that is more or less, that little line is more or less non-existent, and that's because it's really just too tiny. Yeah, 0.4 of a millimeter is really, really tiny. So that's probably not the greatest. So let's look here. See, it says forces. You can see it's bunched up there, bunched up there, bunched up there. But that line, yeah, it's just too tiny. That's just not going to work very well. So, okay. So let's go back over here and into our design file here. So we know that that needs to change for sure. So all I'm going to do is grab that node and this one. So we'll grab that one and that one. Zoom in a little bit here. And we are going to move them up. So now that is a height of 1.2 millimeters. Now that, you know, we may not want it quite that thick, but really it's probably okay. That is probably going to stitch out a lot better anyhow. And then what I did notice too, if we select our eye here, you could see that it's only a 0.5 millimeter wide. So that is definitely not very wide of a satin column. That's kind of step one. And then I want to see what the params are here. So we're going to go into params. And we can see our zigzag spacing is 0.3 or 0.4 millimeter. So with that tiny of text, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. So with that tiny of a text, it probably is better to pull off of the satin a little bit. I'm going to go over here, and I just want you to see this because it's important. So you see that little dot on the forces there? You can see what that actually consists of. See, it doesn't really consist of a whole lot. It's just, you know, so if we were to go back and look here at the little dot, you can see it. That's why it is the way it is, because you're not, you know, it's just very tiny, you know. So it's only a couple of stitches. So, in conclusion, there's nothing per se wrong with the design file. I wouldn't have all of those rungs, but there's nothing wrong with the design file itself. but that tiny text is very tiny. So the expectation can not be that that's all that great. Now, the one reason why you said, oh, but my digitizer, his files look better than my files, and that's probably because he's literally digitizing stitch by stitch by stitch, especially for this really tiny text. So if you look at a file that has small text from your digitizer and look at his stitches compared to these auto-generated stitches, you'll probably see that there's a significant difference between the two and just how they look visually. And so if you look at the stitches that are working for you, that should give you a better indication of what we need to do here inside InkStitch to make our stitches more like their stitches. But there's nothing inherently specifically wrong with your design, really, that I can see the way it is. So one other point to make is you see where there's a cluster and a cluster and a cluster, and that, you know, it's, and even that looks kind of janky. One thing that can help with this very small text is switching to a 65/9 needle with 60 weight embroidery thread. That could definitely help. But I also see a little rat's nest right here that I don't like. And this letter A, you can see it's a bit wonky as well. And I don't know if it's the thread or what, but see here on the end cap of the E, how that looks like thicker than the rest of it. We have another little strange something here. We have a strange something there. So it's not the file. It's not the design. To me, these are embroidery machine related issues. Bobbin tension, thread tension, there's a variety of things that could cause this. But this really tiny text, we might consider using the 60 weight embroidery thread with the little bit smaller needle. That could definitely improve the look of that. So now let's go back over here to our design file. And let's just go ahead and take this. Let's see here. Let's just select all of it. And then let's look at all of it. So we will come in here. We'll choose the stitch plan preview and click on OK. Of course, this does take a few seconds, depending on the speed of your machine, to generate. But I just wanted to show you what the satin stitch here, how that looks in comparison. So yes, you can see how it all looks pretty good, right? All the way across the board. It's just so it looks good and clean, yes. But I do think there are some issues there as far as clearly the jump stitch issue is a problem. So that's definitely one thing that we need to look at to see how that could be improved, because we have way too many jump stitches. But that's one thing that can be improved. And then we might want to consider switching these elements to satin stitches, because I just think it looks prettier versus a fill stitch, because they're relatively small elements. So unfortunately, there's no real definitive answer to the question other than the fact that this is very, very thin text. So it's a half a millimeter wide, so it's extremely tiny. So I personally, what I would do is I would probably look to double the density and use a 60 weight thread. I would start there, try that first on this tiny little text here. And I think you would see that it would be much cleaner. I'm going to do some tests on this file just the way it is because I have 60 weight thread loaded in my machine. I have 65 needles, 65/9 needles, and I want to see how this would stitch out, how cleanly it would stitch out if I increase the density. I'm going to start by doubling the density and stitching it out with the 60 weight thread, but then I might back that off to do 1.5 times the existing density and just look at the difference and see if that doesn't clean that up. Okay, and obviously I would definitely make that piece wider, but then going forward, think about that. I would really encourage you to think about not having elements that are only a half a millimeter, um, that maybe have at least 3/4 of a millimeter to a millimeter as your minimum, as your baseline. I just feel like you'd have easier results of it personally. But you play with it a little bit. Try different settings, different density settings. If we can increase the thickness of this lettering just a touch and see, because this is a half a millimeter and this is 0.8 of a millimeter, and you could see even in your stitch result, this stitched much better than this just because this was a little bit wider. So if we increase this to say, even if you just did 0.7, when we're talking about very small amounts, so it seems insignificant, but really in embroidery, 0.5 is a lot different than 0.7 or 0.8. So, that's just something to kind of keep in mind. But as you get more familiar with stitching things out, you'll know exactly how big your elements need to be to get the result that visually that you like to get. So I hope that gives you a little insight. I will try this out and stitch this out and see if that lighter weight thread with the smaller needle doesn't make a big difference there, and report back to you on that one. Thanks for watching.